What happens when taking a generic Western RPG and replacing the medieval European world with magical China land? Well, the result is Jade Empire. Developed by BioWare and released 2005 before they got assimilated by EA, Jade Empire is BioWare's take on an Eastern mythology RPG, replacing the orcs and elves with fox spirits and kung fu. Starting the game and having reached the main menu, there's not much to do other than starting a new game except for playing previously unlocked minigames, but that's not what anyone is here for, so new game it is. Jade Empire starts with the player in a martial arts school, trading pointers with a junior disciple, which doubles as the tutorial. Unfortunately, this is unskippable, but it's not as bad as it could be. It's mercifully short, and the player is quickly released to explore the school and the surrounding town. It is quickly established that the player character is a special one, not that kind, taught by a wise, grandfatherly teacher, are liked by everyone in the school, and the town is completely peaceful. Now anyone that has played an RPG can probably guess where this leads. That's right, the old man gets himself kidnapped, and everyone in the town is murdered, and it's now up to the player to figure out what is going on and rescue their old master. It's all rather cliched, but cliches can be great if they're done well, and the game has some good twists down the line, with some subtle foreshadowing about what is really going on. It's done well enough that replaying the game a second time, just to see what clues were missed, is rather fun. In their usual fashion, BioWare also added a set of colorful companions that will join and follow the player for their various reasons. It is too bad though that during their travels, only one of the companions can accompany the player at a time, but the player can talk to any one of the companions at the base camp whenever they wish. The resulting conversations range from insightful to downright hilarious, making it well worth talking to all of the companions and exhausting their dialogue options. With 3 of the companions being romanceable, and a male character that plays their cards right is even able to get themselves into a threesome. Just remember, Black Whirlwind is best girl. The unfortunate flip side to all of this is that anyone familiar with BioWare games will probably be able to see the twists coming from a mile away, and once the story is over, a big draw of the game is gone. This does not mean the rest of the game is bad, it's just somewhat wonky. Combat consists of a player using light attacks, power attacks, blocks, and dodges, while selecting from an assortment of martial, support, magic, and weapon styles, combining them in any manner they see fit to defeat their enemies. During this ordeal, ideally the player would never even get hit in the first place. If a player does get hit, they're able to mend their wounds using chi, or they can use said chi to empower their attacks to deal more damage. Finally, if a player ever feels overwhelmed by the amount of enemies they are facing, they can activate focus mode, freezing everyone in time while the player freely moves about. Unfortunately, the controls take a bit of getting used to, the biggest problem being that there is no good way for a player to close the distance between them and an enemy. It is possible to use the dodge to get closer to an enemy, but that usually puts them just outside of striking distance, unless they are the right distance away from the player. The only way to close the rest of the gap is to slowly shuffle at the enemy. This can make fighting enemies with more reach than the player surprisingly difficult. In general, the difficulty of this game is kind of all over the place. Some fights are absurdly easy, and others are just frustrating. This goes double for the first chapter because the player does not have any levels under the belt yet and has not upgraded any stats or styles yet. The difficulty settings do not help much, if at all, since changing the difficulty gives a flat change to the enemy's health and the damage they do to the player. They do not, however, change the AI, or in other words, enemies don't act any different, but it will take what feels like 10 minutes to kill even the most basic of enemies. This makes the high difficulties, especially the New Game Plus difficulty, a Jade Master and extras in tedious frustration. The choice of styles that a player has access to during combat is actually fairly extensive, and there are some cool looking fighting styles. Unfortunately, this usually ends up devolving into just punching people to death, with whatever style the player started out with, due to every style needing to be upgraded separately, while the game only grants more skill points at level up, pushing the player to focus on only a small amount of styles. In addition, weapon styles are ineffective against all ghosts, so probably about half of all the enemies, not to mention they need focus to even work at all. Support styles are largely ineffective. Unless they're fully upgraded or the player is fighting a boss battle, they're not really worth the trouble. Punching enemies in extra time is just much less bothersome in most cases. That is before mentioning Paralyzing Palm exists. This is one of the most gloriously broken things in this game. This support style will freeze any enemy in place, making them unable to do anything for about a second, by default and more when upgraded. The only reason it's not completely broken is it does not do any damage on its own, unless the strikes are empowered with chi. The only thing that comes close to as broken is Mirabelle, which is literally just a gun, but it does count as a weapon style, with all the drawbacks that implies. Magic, though, is rather useful. Even if it needs chi to be cast, it is the only ranged options available to players. A great way to avoid all of the punching and dodging if a player is not in the mood for all of the acrobatics. Unfortunately, just like the martial styles, switching between different styles does not do much other than change the particle effects and the animations. Now, the animations do affect the speed of attacks, with slower animations usually being stronger. It's just that fast attacks win. The amount of damage averages out to about the same, and the fast attacks make stun locking enemies much easier. The wonkiness of the combat is especially noticeable in the later chapters of the game, where instead of having a hub world where combat was interrupted by exploration sections or just meeting and talking to the various denizens of the current locations, they become fairly linear beat-em-up levels, focusing almost entirely on the combat part of the game. This makes them a bit of a drag because the combat becomes rather repetitive at times. To be fair here, the development cycle of this game was rather short, so the last part of the game being a long combat section was most likely due to time constraints. That does make the next part much stranger. The developers decide to add some shoot-em-up minigames in between chapters. These minigames are not bad, it's just that at best, they're a neat gimmick. They can even be skipped completely, without missing out on anything. There are no experience, no monetary, and no skill rewards for completing these minigames. The only reward here is to be able to replay these minigames anytime from the main menu. So, including these games despite the short development cycle, instead of spending the resources on polishing the rest of the game, is just a tad bit odd. All that being said, is Jade Empire actually still worth playing today? Most definitely, yes. Jade Empire is worth at least one playthrough. BioWare has done what they do best, create a setting and then fill the setting with interesting characters. The start of the game might be rather annoying, turning new players away, but stick it through the chapter 1, get some level ups for the player character, and the game becomes much less annoying, letting players enjoy the setting a lot more. A second playthrough will be a bit lackluster though. Alternative dialogue and missed clues are great, but that's about it. And the morality system, while intriguing at first, just boils down to be a dick or don't be a dick, and has little influence on the story overall. Or in short, the main draw of Jade Empire is the writing and the characters a player gets to interact with, while the actual gameplay takes some time getting used to. The game is also not very long, and a player can comfortably finish it over a weekend. Now, before wrapping this up, there is one thing that still needs to be mentioned, and that is Jade Empire's style. Jade Empire was never meant to be modded, so most of the mods available are texture swaps or style mods that add new fighting styles into the game by reusing existing animations. Jade Empire in Style is a compilation of these style mods, as well as an overhaul in how skill points are earned. Instead of at level up, they are granted by defeating enemies. This results in a lot more points being available to a player, allowing them to more freely experiment with different style combinations. Plus, the mod has some minor tweaks to existing styles and combat mechanics. It changes enough things that playing the game again using the mod, after having finished the game the normal way, is worth a go. And with this, I bid you farewell, fellow gentlemen, until we meet again.